En la montaña y el valle, la llanura tropical, el pueblo sufre y anhela paz, justicia y libertad. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer. Tú que diste a mi Bolivia las riquezas del Edén, ayúdanos a gozarlas con justicia y gratitud. Oh, mi tierra prometida, donde fluye leche y miel, su mesa brinda tendida para todos, oh Señor. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer. Ven Cristo a mi Bolivia, nace en cada corazón. Del Ande al Oriente reine tu poder liberador. Uniéndonos como hermanos, reconcílianos tu amor. Y suba desde esta tierra nuestro himno del loor. Todos juntos trabajemos y oremos al Señor. Levantemos la esperanza de un nuevo amanecer.
Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. This is episode number 7, The Early Methodist Missionaries, Educating the Elite and Laying the Groundwork for Revolution, Doing Good but Trapped by Their Culture and Their Times. I am David Stevenson. From the moment I first thought about doing this podcast series, I've been dreading the next few podcasts. I knew that there was one group of persons who were lightning rods of controversy, the U.S. Methodist missionaries. Without a doubt, the next several episodes will be by far the most controversial. The U.S. missionaries look very different from where you sit. To those who live in the United States, including their families and friends and supporters, these missionaries were pioneers, persons who sacrificed incredibly to bring the gospel to a very remote country, a country where most of the baptized persons were Christian in name only, and without any real relationship with Jesus Christ and with God. And when these missionaries' lives, their ministries, and their decisions are looked upon from the United States by their family, friends, and supporters, many of the missionaries are correctly looked upon with admiration and awe at their sacrifices. However, for many of today's indigenous Methodists in Bolivia, many of the early missionaries are also correctly seen as racial and cultural elitists who intertwine Christianity with Western culture, thus pressuring the indigenous people who wish to become Christian to also deny their indigenous culture and become Westernized. Clearly, many of the early missionaries carried the racial prejudices and racial elitism of the white race with them as they traveled to Bolivia. I am doing my very best to give an accurate interpretation of the lives and works of the early missionaries, of what happened and why. I've talked to former U.S. missionaries and indigenous pastors. I've spoken to Mestizo Methodists and indigenous Methodists. Believe me, they have two, if not even more, very, very different interpretations of what happened and why. I want to be as balanced and fair as possible, but I must admit that I mostly identify myself with the indigenous Methodists of today and am strongly influenced by their views of these events, and that will definitely affect my interpretation. Over the next few podcasts, we're going to hear about those amazing yet naive U.S. missionaries who overcame huge obstacles to bring the gospel to Bolivia, who were the first to reach out and evangelize the indigenous people, especially those in the countryside, who brought liberal education to the Criollo and the Mestizo populations, which helped lead to the 1952 land reform revolution, and later brought education to the indigenous people who would become the center for the struggle for human rights for the indigenous people of all of Bolivia. But we will also hear about how they were persons of their time, how they brought the views of the Jim Crow era in the United States and showed the struggle for white folks to end racial prejudice and oppression, which is still a battle in the United States today. It is important to understand these issues within their full context. It's unfair to blame these missionaries for their racial prejudices, since they worked in a time from 1906 to the 1940s when racism was just a fact of life throughout the world in every culture, and they were merely reflecting the culture of their day. You will hear stories of amazing sacrifices made by these early missionaries, their huge impact on the history of Bolivia, about those who began to reach out to the indigenous, and about those who punished them for doing so. But today I want to speak about the first U.S. missionary and those who quickly followed and came to Bolivia in those early years from 1906 through the 1930s and 40s. I have heard the stories and opinions I'm about to share from many indigenous pastors and laypersons within the IMB over the decades. However, as I did in the last episode, in this and the next two episodes, I am relying heavily on the research and writing of Pastor Gustavo Loza, son of both Aymara and Quechua parents, and a pastor of the IMB who's currently serving in Cochabamba. Pastor Loza did the research and documentation which demonstrates the truth of those opinions. Some of the information comes from his paper, The Mission of the Methodist Church is Part of the Fabric in Bolivia, Weaving the Big Multicolor Aguayo of the Aymara People, written in July 2007. Additional material came from an interview I had with Pastor Loza on August 21, 2019. I've gained some great information and insight from a paper entitled, quote, Protestant Christianity in Bolivia, Mission Theory and Practice in Three Mission Churches, unquote, which was the PhD dissertation of Wilson Boots for a degree as a Doctor of Philosophy in Latin American Studies at the American University in August of 1971. I've also added material from Pastor Delphine Quispe, particularly on the early years of Francis Harrington. I especially want to thank Pastor Juan Covarrubias, former director of the American Institute in Cochabamba, for his editorial review and suggestions. Again, I remind you, I am not a historian, but a storyteller, so I'm focusing on some human stories and skipping a lot of very important history. Before we get to Bolivia, Dr. Boots tells an interesting story about one of the first Methodist missionaries to South America, William Taylor, a pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church, or the ME Church, of the United States, who had done some mission work in India on behalf of the ME Board of Missions. In 1878, Reverend Taylor set sail for the west coast of South America to find a suitable location to begin a school which would allow for there to be a self-supporting mission to the people of South America. He specifically refused to work with or under the control or direction of the mission agency of the Methodist Episcopal Church because he felt that many of their missionaries needed weeding out, as he said. He believed that often missionaries sent by the missions agencies were inefficient and unsuccessful. Boots says that Taylor wrote, quote, the person who lacks ability, who lacks energy, who is inclined to take life easy, who lacks love of people among whom he labors, cannot win the favor of the people or to secure self-support. Such a person has to leave the field. Supported from home, the missionary might go on for years and accomplish little, end quote. In 1878, at Antofagasta, which was then the chief seaport of Bolivia, Taylor found an English-speaking community which supported a pastor and a school. Things were going well until Bolivia lost Antofagasta in 1883 to Chile in the War of the Pacific. The pastor and his wife were forced to leave. Taylor's work along the west coast of South America continued to have some success. However, in a pattern that we will see repeated over and over again in South America, the Board of Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church was unhappy because he worked outside of the system and wasn't under their control. Then, in a move that could be interpreted either as an endorsement of his work or interpreted As a clever way to force him back under their control and remove him from his base support, the Methodist Episcopal Church elected him bishop and then immediately transferred him to Africa, which cut him off from his work in South America. A group of supporters developed a nonprofit in order to try to continue his work, but I doubt it lasted very long without their dynamic leader. At the beginning of the 20th century, just getting to Bolivia was a tremendously arduous task. Bolivia was one of the most remote places in the world. First, you would travel by boat from New York around the southern tip of Argentina. Remember, there's no Panama Canal until 1914. And up the west coast of South America to either Peru or Chile. While travel by ship to Peru was relatively easy, travel up to La Paz, and I mean way, way up, over passes of 15,000 feet or higher, was incredibly difficult. There were no railroads from the west coast of South America to Bolivia until 1913. I'm sure that it took well over a month to get to La Paz from the Methodist headquarters in New York, perhaps longer. It wasn't until the late 1920s that travel back and forth between the U.S. and Bolivia became a real possibility. The first South American airline was a Bolivian one, Lloyd Air Boliviano, which began in 1925. Accessible air travel didn't come to La Paz until the late 50s or so with the construction of the airport in El Alto, La Paz. Receiving letters, additional equipment, and supplies from the U.S. took months at a time. And when the missionaries arrived in Bolivia, even in the major cities, life was difficult for North Americans. I couldn't find when electricity became common in La Paz, but the first national electricity company wasn't formed until the 1960s. Electricity in the cities didn't become reliable and consistent until around that time. For the first decade of my travels to Bolivia from 1987 to 1997, the plane would arrive over the Altiplano, Bolivia in the pre-dawn hours, and you look down in the dark where tens of thousands of people lived, and you wouldn't see a single light. Electricity in the towns and small communities in the Campo didn't come until the 1980s and the 1990s, and really wasn't common in those communities until after 2006. Water and sewage was and is horrible in the cities and in the countryside. And remember, it wasn't just the missionaries who went. These were families, often with young children. These missionary children would be deprived of a U.S. education and from growing up in their own U.S. culture. I'm sure many potential missionaries turned down appointments to Bolivia because they didn't want their children to suffer through these difficulties. Although many of the children of the missionaries who came didn't find it difficult at all, and some have remained in Bolivia throughout their life. And if you died, there was no way to transport the body back to the U.S. for burial. You were buried right there in Bolivia. Most of the missionaries are buried in a wonderful little cemetery owned and run by the British Embassy in La Paz. But the saddest graves are those of the missionaries' children who died and are buried there. An additional problem was the poor preparations for mission work in Bolivia that was provided by the Board of Missions of the Methodist Church. Many missionaries arrived without the ability to speak Spanish, much less any of the indigenous languages. They knew nothing of the Bolivian culture, especially the cultures of the indigenous peoples living in Bolivia. But the greatest danger to the U.S. Methodist missionaries came from the Bolivian government and the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church had almost complete control of the religious and cultural life of Bolivia, and they wanted to stop Protestants from evangelizing in Bolivia. And the government wanted to keep the indigenous uneducated and unable to question the status quo of their domination by the Criollo. And don't forget this unholy alliance I've talked about between the Catholic Church and the Criollo elite to keep the status quo where the Criollo were unchallenged rulers of Bolivian government, industry, and the economy. Francis and Mary Harrington moved from Iowa to take an appointment as a missionary in Iquique, Chile, to teach English at the Methodist school there and to be pastor of the English-speaking congregation. They were there for 4 years, and Francis and Mary learned Spanish. But Francis contracted a serious case of pneumonia and returned to the United States for 6 months to recover. The Harringtons returned to Chile in 1905. The Harringtons wanted to move on to La Paz, but the penalty for spreading any religion other than the official Roman Catholic religion in Bolivia was death. These challenges were responsible for the fact that Bolivia was the last country in South America to receive Protestant missionaries. After liberation from Spain in 1825, Bolivia was a republic. In 1906, a liberal anti-clerical leader became president, Ismael Montes, and under his rule there was a change in the constitution which theoretically gave freedom of worship in Bolivia. But the law with the penalty of death for proselytizing was still on the books, though ignored by the liberal anti-clerical government. However, as we all know, just because a law is passed doesn't mean that every person in every village nor every priest accepted the new law. This law allowing Protestant worship in Bolivia still recognized the Roman Catholic Church as the official state religion. The existence of Methodist churches was unevenly allowed throughout Bolivia. In the cities, inviting Criollo and Mestizo persons to worship was generally accepted, and so-called white Methodist churches were formed in La Paz and Cochabamba and a few other major cities. However, some local priests, especially in the countryside or the campo, often took very radical stances against the introduction of Protestantism in their village. Catholic priests preached anti-Protestant sermons and even occasionally encouraged local community members to attack Protestants and Protestant missionaries in their villages. I'm going to be telling you some of those stories over the next few weeks. However, the new liberal government wanted the kind of education that many Criollo elite Bolivian children were receiving at the Methodist school in Iquique and the Presbyterian school in Santiago. So the government invited the school in Iquique to establish a school in La Paz. Los's paper tells how in 1906, Francis Harrington, his wife, and 3 children were sent by the U.S. Board of Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church to begin mission work in Bolivia. He found himself in the middle of this cultural and religious battle. It was still illegal and punishable by death to proselytize, but theoretically legal to have Protestant worship. So another way had to be found to establish the Methodist Church. Adding to the difficulties, the Bolivian missions were expected by the Board of Missions to be self-supporting in the style of William Taylor. So Harrington and other Methodist missionaries did what Protestant missionaries have done and continues to do today, where Christian evangelism is illegal. They brought education. We will continue this story and the story of Francis Harrington and the American Institutes in our next episode. Our next episode, in that episode, I will talk about how Harrington came in and developed the American Institutes and how the American Institutes had a huge impact on the life of all of Bolivia and helped bring democracy. Remember that you can send your comments or thoughts about this episode either directly to me or by email at tulsadstevenson@yahoo.com or through the comment area connected to this episode at the website www.weavingtheblanket.com. Thank you very much.